SaaS Therapy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of SaaS Therapy, the show where we help you save your most important business relationships, your customers. My name is Todd Kirk. I'm your host. I'm joined by the ever-present and wonderful Casey Trujillo. Casey, welcome, as always.
Sir. That I would say for the first time in my introduction, you nailed it, Todd. Like you
Oh.
properly introduced me. Thank you so much.
Well, lies. Regardless, the good news is today we have a wonderful guest. I'm super excited to have Matt Collier on from who was most recently the Chief Customer Officer at Pluralsight, who is a Vista Equity company and might be relevant to some of our conversations later on. Matt was previously the Senior Vice President of Client Success at Signified. He has led CS for multiple business units at Adobe and Marketo, Adobe Campaign. And he was also the VP of Client Success at Marketo through their journey as a public company, being taken private by Vista Equity, and then subsequently then the sale back to Adobe. So he's obviously gone through, I guess, a lot of transition when it comes to ownership in various SaaS companies. So we're excited to get his insight there. Matt is also, he's unique as a CS leader, as he's typically owned the full post-sales customer lifecycle, specifically including retention and expansion teams. And Matt is currently consulting with Series A and B startups on all aspects of go-to-market strategy with an approach that prioritizes scalable long-term value creation through a customer-centric lens. So basically, like all the kind of stuff that I love to geek out about. So Matt, welcome to SaaS Therapy. We're pumped to have you here, man.
Yeah, thanks guys. It's great to be here.
Well, the real question that I want to ask that I don't think Matt will give me an honest answer is he's gone through all of that, working with Vista, working at Pluralsight, working at Adobe, and he still has an amazing set of hair. For those that are watching on the YouTube channel, like killer hair, but he's gone through all this stress. That's not possible, Matt. You're a unicorn already. I can tell.
Okay, well, this is already feeling like therapy because you're asking me to divulge details and talk about maybe some of my insecurities. There's a lot of gray hair, and there's definitely been some stress. But no, I've been super fortunate to go through a variety of journeys with a few companies, VC backed, PE backed, public companies, large organizations, small, fast growing organizations. So yeah, I've been fortunate to have a wealth of experience and a lot of learnings coming out of those.
That's so awesome. So, some of our guests might know you. They might have even worked with you. Others like, I really don't know who this individual is. So we like to let them know a little bit about your personality. So we play a game at the beginning called Would You Rather? And so I'm going to ask you some of these questions. We could just do 3 questions. Give us the answer that you think is most applicable to you. And if you want to give any reasoning behind it, you feel free to do so. So here is the first question for you. Would you rather have a terrible boss, but a great job, or a great boss and a terrible job?
Oh, easily the latter, for sure.
Oh, really?
Yes. All businesses are going to be a challenge, right? Like there's no just like amazing business that you think you're going to join and everything's going to be great. But the reality is like your boss, your manager is going to dictate your life. And not only in this role, but like future roles. I've been so lucky to have such great bosses that are now mentors and people that I keep in touch with regularly. And especially when you go through, the trials and tribulations that a lot of SaaS businesses go through, you fight those battles together, like you build such an amazing connection. So if we had to simplify, I'm going to go for, a maybe tough business with an amazing boss.
A great answer. Okay. This one is, I think, going to be a little bit harder. And I threw this in because of, hey, we're in the elections. So I thought this one would be fantastic. Okay. Ready? Would you rather have a 10-hour dinner with the headstrong politician from your opposing party, or attend a 10-hour concert for a music group you hate?
All right, that's a good one. Well, I mean, you said this was going to be harder. It's also, I would say, fairly easy. It's the former. Politics aside, like they're interesting conversations. Like I'd love to understand somebody's perspective on certain, whether it's policies or social issues. like a 10-hour dinner with whoever your candidate may be would be fascinating.
Mm.
If it's a band I don't love, that's painful. Shoot me in the head and let me leave.
Awesome. And then the last question, would you rather have an in-person meeting with your coworkers or have an online meeting with your coworkers?
Okay, these are like T-balls that you're throwing up here. In person for sure.
In person. All right.
Yeah, I've been remote based well before even COVID hit. And so I've done, remote, virtual, flying to see teams, hosting offsites, all of that. But like nothing actually can replace an amazing face-to-face interaction, especially a small group. If you're in a room working on a whiteboard, or if you're actually doing an offsite with like larger organization, those are insanely valuable. So yeah, I'm all for virtual, right? Our setups that we have here, it allows us to have this conversation, but nothing replaces face-to-face.
Amen. Todd, where do we start today?
Well, first, I think we need to chastise you for having terrible get to know you questions. Apparently, geez, you got to make them? You got to make them harder next time, Casey.
Yeah,
So.
my therapist asks way more difficult questions. So,
So Matt, one of the things that we were talking before about the idea of discussing metrics and key performance indicators, and one of the things that I'm really interested to get your take on is just the fact that when it comes to client success in particular, and trying to measure the health of your accounts, there's kind of become some conventional wisdom of things that we track. And I don't know if they're always the most telling and informational to know if you're really doing a good job. And maybe it'd be a good idea to start there. From your perspective, what should client success teams be measuring and focusing on versus maybe the things that they are currently focusing on? Where are the gaps between what they should be doing and what they are doing today?
yeah. So I think what's like really interesting about client success, customer success as an industry, right, is that the scope is so broad that there's so much that you're responsible for. Therefore, there's so much that you can measure and try to kind of elevate your organization and bring, different functions together around. Like you could pick and measure 1,000 different things. I think there's a fundamental baseline that all customer success leaders need to have. And I always put it in just two general buckets of your leading and your lagging. And you should be having a lot of those metrics, right? Leading metrics are around things like adoption, feature, function, utilization. Like, are you actually achieving certain milestones? You can look at, NPS, CSAT, those types of things. And then lagging, even if you don't own, I would say, commercial metrics specifically, you should be reporting on and measuring things like gross revenue retention, net revenue retention. You can look at, expansion bookings, pipeline creation, those types of things. So I think there's a baseline that the industry has normalized around. And then you can double click and you can go a lot deeper. Like I know one of the common ones we'll probably talk about is health score, right? And I think companies can do this in a massively differentiated way, or it can be complete noise. And there's a lot of frustration and fatigue around a health score. So we can double click into that. But as a baseline, I think those are just the standard things you need to be measuring.
Okay, Matt. So at what point should I start? Since you've done this whole customer experience journey from beginning to end in post-sales, when should I be looking at standardizing on KPIs? Is it right at the beginning? Is it first identifying the experience you want the people to go through and then working backwards to understand that? Like, we have all sorts of different, in our audience, we have people that are in a Series A, a Series B. We have very mature SaaS organizations. So sometimes I feel like people really start pounding on KPIs and they just don't even have down what's that onboarding experience and handoff to CS. Like they don't even have that down yet. So how would you balance that? And at what point, and I know it's always depends, but at what point do you really start to hone in and start to focus down on KPIs?
Yeah, well, I think whatever you're going to measure in your business is always a journey, right? It's never static. They're always going to evolve and progress, and they're probably going to become more complex and detailed, and that's a good thing. But early on, and right now, like the Series A and B companies that I'm consulting with, I definitely encourage them to establish a baseline of metrics that they're going to measure. It doesn't have to be everything that I just mentioned as kind of the table stakes, right? Because a lot of companies, Series A, they're $2 million or so. They might not even be thinking about things like, well, how do we generate expansion pipeline, right? They're just like, hey, we've closed some amazing logos. We want to try to keep them. And that's rightly their focus. But they should also be thinking about things like efficiency metrics, right? Like, what does it cost us to actually service this customer? Like, don't just say, okay, we're going to hire a CSM, we're going to create a generic JD and just go at it, right? Like, think about like, what are the activities we want them to do? How much does it cost? And then you can start to add scale and process on top of that. Like, okay, well, now we've got, double the amount of customers, right? Can we add a headcount and can we have them follow the same process? So I think like establishing metrics early is a great thing. They'll evolve over time as your business grows and becomes more complex.
Makes sense.
So for me, when I think about KPIs, a lot of times I guess a couple of years ago, OKRs became kind of all the rage, and the idea of the difference for me, I've loved the description of a KPI is the gauges in your car to help you know if it's running, and an OKR is the milestone of where you want to go. And one of the things that I sometimes wonder about is what would you say, at least for a CS team, is more important? Because like health score is kind of like, how is the engine running, right? But then how do you then balance that with kind of these strategic vision milestones that you want to get to down the road?
Yeah, I think at any size of your organization, your CSM specifically, and your CS organization should at least be aware and understanding how the work that they're doing is driving those strategic objectives of your organization and then your business. Doesn't mean that they're necessarily focused on those strategic objectives, but they have to understand that this is where the business is going and why their day-to-day work is so important to get there. And of course, in startup land, when you're going quickly and there's a lot of fires everywhere, it can be more difficult to pick your head out of the weeds and say, hey, look at all this progress that we've made, and we're actually helping to achieve this big strategic objective. But I do think that that's really important. It adds a lot of purpose and meaning and intentionality behind the work. It's not just like, hey, let's make these customers successful, do whatever we have to do. So I think to your point, Todd, because you mentioned OKRs, which like I love the concept. I've always used a framework of, I call it vision, strategy, and tactics, where vision is my organization, where are we headed? The strategies are the big picture things, the big bets that we're going to make on this is what's going to actually drive the business forward. The tactics are the specific projects that have metrics tied to them. So in all of my all hands meetings or large organization meetings, like I would typically start with that framework. I would say, hey, this is where we're going. These are the big things that we're doing. And then here's how we're progressing towards that. So metrics from my org, I would look at all of them. For CSMs, I think, the individual contributors, they need to be aware of how their work is driving the business forward.
So Matt, okay, as a CS person, I consistently hear this quite frequently. Is I can only do so much. Last week you told me I needed to get my customer to do this. This week you're telling me I need to make 6 more new connections. So, if this point of contact leaves, I have, 5 other point of contacts. How do we keep our customer success team feeling that they're just not trying to accomplish a goal to make you happy, Matt? Because you're holding this hands-on meeting and look, I did my thing, check mark, check mark, check mark, but I just lost that deal because I was so focused on that. How do you balance this? What's the principles, the tips, the tricks in helping someone understand how to do that correctly from all these experiences? And if you could give some examples of good, bad, effective, those are always appreciated.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I think like as a concept, there's always going to be more work to be done than is possible, right? At every level and every organization. So, prioritization is massively important. And I always do think about like what is urgent and what is most important, and making sure that I'm balancing my time and my days based on those, right? I'm not just solving for the urgent things. I'm also working on the big important things. I encourage every one of my organizations to do that. So individual CSM should be doing that as well. And that's where, again, you need to hire great people that make those decisions. They can understand the trade-off, and you need to empower them to be able to do that. But from an organizational standpoint, Casey, to your comment, kind of like what's worked well, what doesn't. It's interesting. I've seen a lot of businesses where, they build their segmentation methodology and then they design a customer journey. and they say, okay, let's look at our headcount capacity. We're going to create the activities that we want our CSMs to do. And they basically just say, like, okay, go and be successful. Sometimes they'll think about like a percent of revenue that they should spend, right, on this activity. But that's not very customer centric from my perspective, and it's not very employee friendly, right? Because you're just saying, hey, I've now assigned all these things to do, and I don't have a great understanding of if it's possible and what's actually driving results or not. So what I've seen work really well differently is, rather than just create an expectation of like, hey, here's the customer journey and here's what I want you to do, is to really focus in on, well, what are the specific things that are actually going to drive outcomes for our customers? This requires a lot more thought and analysis up front, right? You have to actually look into the data, maybe even do things like a regression analysis to understand like, hey, there is this specific thing. If we get a customer to this milestone or use this feature or function, they are way more likely to retain. Like, what are then the activities that we need to fund to get them to do that? And then design your engagement model and your expectations with your CSM team around that specifically. So always focus on like the few number of things that are really going to drive results, not just create a generic engagement model and say, hey, go be successful. I wish you the best.
So, I really love that point there, Matt. And it makes me wonder a lot because so many CSMs feel like, well, the key to getting my customer to renew is having as many touch points and engagements with them as possible. So their focus becomes busyness, and then they try to make that happen. But if you do a real statistical analysis, my guess is there's a very weak correlation between how many times I meet with my CSM and the likelihood that I renew, right? And so I'd be curious, from when you think about the metrics that you've seen work, and I mean, of course, every product is different, every industry is different, every customer is different. But have you ever, when you've looked at those analyses in the past, could you give us some examples of things that you have seen are really strong correlators to retention, maybe beyond busyness of the CSM?
Yeah. So definitely anything that's activity based, busyness, like number of QBRs, number of touch points, like not a big fan, likely not very correlated to outcomes. You could perhaps double click and you could look at like the quality of those conversations and the engagement level. And, maybe that's going to be more correlated. But as a philosophy, like activity metrics are not great leading indicators. To me, they're almost just the fundamental blocking and tackling. That's the basic kind of accountability that we say we're going to agree to do as an organization, but not correlated to outcomes. I think better metrics that are going to be correlated to outcomes. And again, it depends on if you're thinking about owning like the leading indicators or also the lagging indicators. Are you focused on commercial, or are you just focused on, value realization and adoption? But milestones achieved, whatever that is for your product, right? And this is where you have to have an intimate understanding of the reality of the customer experience and what it's required to get to your business objective. So that could be a certain feature or function that they've adopted and started to utilize. Maybe it's even something like number of integrations completed. Like I remember at Marketo, that was one of our key, I would say, focus areas, is how do we actually get our CSMs to encourage our customers to integrate more and more into the solution? We did an analysis to understand that once we reached a certain level, gross revenue retention was above 95%. And so the focus became not just touch your customers as much as you can, but what is your comprehensive like go-to-market solution? And are there other technologies that you need to plug into your marketing automation platform that are going to help everyone be successful? So it's very specific on your business. It's very specific on your product. But those are the things that I've seen that are much more correlated to outcomes, definitely not activity.
Do you ever advise someone to compensate their CS team on KPIs? Or is that just a way to try to measure the likelihood of renewal, is they're doing these things and how well your CS person is doing? What's your philosophy on that? We argue it both ways. Yes, you should. Maybe you shouldn't. Like, I would love to see both sides of that.
Yeah. And this is, again, where the role of a CCO is so complex because you own that entire life cycle and you are driving success early and you own commercial outcomes late. And how do you incentivize your team across that entirety can be a challenge for sure. So I'm a fan of one, philosophically, customer success should own commercial outcomes, and the incentive structure should be based around commercial metrics like gross revenue retention, net revenue retention, et cetera. But also, you have to make sure that you're driving focus early on in the life cycle around these key things that we're talking about, these key KPIs. So yes, I think you can incentivize your team on achieving those specific things. You have to have confidence in the data that those are going to deliver outcomes, because you don't just want to be incentivizing and driving behavior if you don't really have conviction that this is what's important. But yes, absolutely. If you as an organization believe, hey, we need to get our customers to do A, B, and C, these are the key milestones. Absolutely. I think you can incentivize your team to accomplish those.
It makes me wonder. So at least a lot of the CSMs that I talk with some of them feel really at home being in a world where they're compensated on a commercial outcome, right? They want to drive expansion. They want to drive renewal. There are others who more or less come from a services background, and they're way more interested in the relationship of the customer and, making sure that they're really likable and that the customer feels really happy, and is very focused on satisfaction. And, my guess is, given your take there, that you're like, well, there isn't a strong correlation potentially with satisfaction and renewal either. So again, let's focus on actually driving the metrics that get to the outcome that we want. So my question, and that's implied in there, I guess, is what would you say to companies that are struggling with their identity of who they want their CSMs to be? If it's more around them being a value add themselves, right? Because a lot of times the CSM is viewed as a billable, valuable resource that they're paying for. And others, they're actually more like an account manager who's trying to drive growth and expansion within the account. How do you balance that with the different kind of, it almost seems like even warring factions in the CS world of trying to determine what CS should be long-term?
Yeah. It's such a good question. We could dive so deep and go in a variety of ways here. Let me take like a kind of a step back and just like opine on like the CS industry, right? Because it started philosophically on, no, we drive value, we focus on adoption. This is not a commercial organization. And like monetized customer success wasn't even a thing, right? It moved into, no, this should be more of it's not a cost center, it's a revenue generating organization. They should be accountable for commercial metrics. That's been a thing. And then now in this kind of post ZERP era, right, it's been a focus on efficiency, productivity. CSMs are increasingly a commercial organization. They're moving under things like CROs and becoming a part of go-to-market. I think a really interesting next phase is going to be this gap around what I call like the technical advisory gap. And I don't know if you guys saw, but Bain & Co. released a survey, or it was a report recently, on kind of customers' perception of these technical offerings, and then an internal customer success perspective on them. And there was a massive difference in what was perceived as valuable. And so what that tells me is that like there's still a debate in the customer success world, and customers organizations are struggling to define their identity. Like, what are we? How do we serve our customers? What's truly driving value? I think this technical gap is going to become a bigger and bigger part of customer success organizations. I think they're going to have to think about, okay, well, do we have somebody who's an expert in implementing? Does that person stay on throughout the customer journey, right? Is this a paid for resource? Is there, kind of expert professional services? Is there paid for customer support? Is there paid for customer success? But how are we providing value beyond just the like, hey, here's how you can use the solution and get value from it, into more technical, like here are the specific detailed things that you need to do, and here's more like prescriptive strategic advice. So Todd, yeah, organizations are struggling to define their identity, and that's going to impact, the CSMs that you're going to hire for. What are the skill sets that you're looking for? So there's a lot of change going on in the customer success industry. It's a really valid question.
Matt, I'm going to play a hypothetical with you. You've been brought in to be the CEO and the CCO of a new company. Okay. They're a very established company. You come in, you're taking over. The data is telling us, Okta gave us this data, that there's the average organization uses at least 187 different software applications. And that's on the low end. Most
that was
businesses,
2023. Casey Okta says it's double that now. So
yeah. Right. So you think about that, Matt, is that there's for most of these SaaS applications, there's a customer success manager calling someone at that organization. So the organization, they've bought 200, let's just say 200 applications. There's 200 CSMs calling into that one organization. One of those point of contacts is maybe talking to 6 or 7 of these different vendors. And so they're having 6 or 7 different customer success managers talk with them. Mm-hmm. You've taken over this new company. You're like, my CS team is going to stand out. We're one of the things that my point of contact is going to want to meet with us. We're going to better utilize their time than any other software application. What are you going to do? What are the skills that you're looking for from a CS person? You have unlimited budget. You can spend whatever you want on a CS team. What's the skill set you're looking for to make your CS team stand out? Not this, you're not competing against a software and software. You're competing just in time because these other software applications want this person's time too. It's not like, it's not like Zoom meeting versus WebEx meeting versus a Teams meeting. No, it is different applications, but this one person at the organization has to run all those. So what would you look for in a CS team to make your team stand out?
Yeah. Okay. I love the philosophical questions because, I'd say I probably have a strong point of view here. And you're totally right. The reality that you're describing is the reality. Like, even though I think, budgets have decreased generally and people are trying to cut vendors, or at least they're cutting seats and licenses and those types of things. But that battle for attention is still absolutely there. And most SaaS applications are completely underutilized, right? And they buy the promise and that dream is never fully realized. Hence the role of the CSM to try to get them there. So what I would do as a CEO, right? If I was CEO and CS leader of a new organization, an established business, firstly, like, take a big step back. Don't just think about customer success as an organization and say, hey, this is what it should do. Think about like the customer perspective. Like, truly, what are they trying to accomplish? What are our customers' strategic objectives? Why did they buy this solution, and how can we help them accomplish that? The reality is that customers can get value from your solution in a variety of ways, obviously via the product itself, education, community, like marketing engagement, right? There's services, support. Customer success is one piece of that. And while they own the overall relationship and they own the outcomes for the customer, so they have the responsibility to drive success within your organization internally, I would take a big step back and think about, hold on, firstly, like, what does a customer actually need to do to be successful, to realize that strategic objective? So maybe it's more of a focus on like, what is the product engagement, right? And how does CS actually drive a better customer experience? How do they work with the product organization to improve that product, to drive more features or functions, or, improve these things that they've been requesting, right? Maybe it's something that's totally different, right? Maybe it's like, hey, they're looking for more of a community experience. They want to learn and self-educate. Like, how do we actually give them the right resources in a really compelling and interesting way to drive success? I do think there's a really important role for customer success to play in my organization. And again, I do think they need to be the overall champion for the customer and then drive that success internally. But I wouldn't say that they're necessarily like the only organization that's responsible for customer success. As a CEO, I would take a big step back and say, okay, what's actually going to be driving success for our customers?
So I like that a lot. I don't know how to piggyback off of this fake scenario now that you have this amazing company where you have unlimited resource and can do whatever the heck that you want. But it does raise the question for me when you think about all the different factors that contribute to the customer getting outcomes. I love that you mentioned the fact that, well, it's not just CS, and we need to recognize that there are all these other factors. And unfortunately, I think a lot of SaaS companies kind of operate independently. The product marketing effort, or the PLG efforts, or the digital scale efforts, or the CS-led efforts, or the implementation team, or whatever those different organizations might be that are impacting these outcomes. They oftentimes operate in too siloed of a manner and have different metrics that they're trying to drive with the customer. So now that Casey's made you the CEO of this make-believe company, right? What else would you focus on outside of CS to try to drive outcomes for the customer?
Yeah. And this is, again, the role of the customer success, the chief customer officer, right, is I think such a critical organization, and they truly need to be empowered in a way to drive that clarity and cross-functional alignment within your organization. So I would look at all of those individual functions, and they do need to have their own focus areas. But at the end of the day, right, if you're driving customer centricity as an organization, like you need somebody to be that champion, and that needs to be that chief customer officer, which means rethinking the organization. It's not as simple as like, hey, we've done an amazing job selling all these new logos. Just make sure you renew them. And by the way, build some pipeline for the sales organization, right? It needs to be, no, the CCO, the customer success organization is actually the representative of the customer. They have the data, the insights to understand what each function needs to do to deliver customer success. And so I would try to empower that CCO to gather that data, gather those insights, to hold those other functions accountable to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to make customers successful.
It's funny, Matt. We've had recent guests. The person was over customer success operations. We had someone that was just on they were the head of customer experience. And then we have you on as the CCO in your past experience. And I'm like, everybody's persuading me that all these roles are needed because it seems like every organization doesn't have all of these pieces. And like Todd said, it all seems a little bit siloed. Matt, I work best off of my failures. I'm a person that when I fail, it's like, oh man, I should have seen that. And I get better because of it. As we're talking about KPIs, what are your top 3 tips in you're probably failing if you're doing these things? Like, what are the things you're consistently seeing with KPIs where gosh, that's failing and you need to learn from this? What would be those things that when you're coming in and you're observing an organization and a CS unit that you're like, let's change this. That's not going to work. What would be some tips that you've seen?
Yeah. And because again, it's SaaS Therapy. So I'm going to admit that I've had my fair share of failures and learnings. But yeah, I would say some of them we mentioned before, right? Like the focus on activity-based metrics. That's kind of an easy one to me. Again, those are accountability metrics. They're not actually KPIs. It's not how the business is performing. So that's a first. Second one, to probably dive deeper into is the health score. And if I see a health score that is massively complicated, that has lost a lot of trust from its different stakeholders, meaning the executive team, the board, leadership, other functions, right? If I see a very complex hairball of a health score, like that needs to be corrected pretty quickly. And right, there's a lot of different vendors out there that can help you design your health score, whether it's an actual, kind of customer success platform or if there's more, point solutions. But that's one thing where, again, I would encourage everyone to take a step back and think about like, okay, let's not try to like create this amazing equation that is going to, 1, predict financial performance, and then 2, empower my customer success organization in a predictive way to go and solve the customers that are having challenges. Like, you don't have to create the most amazing algorithm, right? You do need to solve for those 2 things. But I think you have to fundamentally think about like, what is the customer journey? What are those key milestones, the moments that matter, the pieces of, the features or the functions or the tools that we actually have to get them to do? And how do we measure those? I think that's a much better use of your time and effort. And I wouldn't go down the rabbit hole of trying to design the most comprehensive health score imaginable. I think that could be a big failure.
So, Casey and I were talking before the show about is it better for us to have these conversations in the morning or in the afternoon? And we can never tell if we have better and more fun and more enlightening conversations if we do them in the afternoon or in the morning. So I don't know the answer to that, by the way. Just when it comes to the KPIs of our podcast, I can't tell you which ones are better yet. But what I can tell you is that I do know that my attitude and my readiness to either think critically or to think creatively changes throughout every day, right? And at different times of the day, I get worn out from doing heads down work or being on tons of calls, and I just want to go wander around the office, stretch, and drink some soda and eat candy. And then there are other times where I'm just like want to go and whiteboard and have fun and be super unstructured. So this is a really long-winded way, Matt, of me just saying when it comes to KPIs and the failure of KPIs, sometimes I think it's because we suck at measuring the right things, but also I think it's just because as humans, we really struggle to be consistent because we're constantly changing our emotional state based off of the activities that we do throughout the day. And I'd be curious to get your take on how, because I think fatigue you mentioned that at the beginning of KPI fatigue. I think sometimes it's related to measuring the wrong things, but other times it's really related on like just all these other external factors that are wearing us down. And I'd be curious your take on how you balance that. Is there a way to make KPIs less tiring, and what are factors that you should consider to make it easier to be able to focus more strategically on these ideas?
Yeah, it's a good question, Todd. I thought you were going to go down the road of like how much coffee do you drink and when and
Yeah, that's what I need you to tell me. When do I need my caffeine fix? When do I take my nap? When do I do my yoga? If you could structure my day perfectly so I'm always 100% productive, that would be
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah. I'll send you my calendar. You can just kind of copy and paste that. Yeah. No, but yeah, your question is a good one in terms of like, yeah, there's so much to measure. There's fatigue. Things are changing. Obviously, also with the customer success organization, right? There's always like fires. There's urgent things that happen, right? Bugs, issues, products, right? Like there's so many things, and so like how do you have continuity? How do you have focus? But how are you also kind of adaptable and adjust as needed? I think that's a leadership challenge. I think it's a leadership skill set because you do need to drive clarity in your organization. You have to have consistency. So I'm a big fan of like annual planning, right? Or then like setting like an OKR framework. This is where we're going as an organization. These are the big bets that we're making. Here are the projects that we're going to do to get there. But also, right, you have to be adaptable. Things are going to change and happen, and that might mean a little bit of a detour. It might mean changing, and we're looking at a different KPI, and this is what's going to be important for the next quarter. I think what's important is like as a leader, right, you have to help explain that to your organization, right? Like,
Yeah.
why is it important that we need to pivot a little bit and look at
Right.
this, right? And why is this the most important thing for our customers? You can definitely get like change management fatigue if you're running around all over the place and you don't have that clarity and that big picture focus of like, hey, this is where the industry is going and this is where we need to be as an organization, right? It can just feel like a chicken with your head cut off and you're running around all over the place. So I think it's got to be a healthy mix. And again, I think like a great leader is able to articulate like the vision and then the process to get there, including the adaptability on a more short-term basis. Plus
Right.
lots of caffeine,
Caffeine.
albeit not super late in the afternoon because we need to get to bed early. But yeah.
Well, and Matt, I think just to wrap that up, because I loved your response there. I think the thing that I always wonder about is it do we have the discipline, and as a leader, right, do you have the discipline to stay on course and keep people focused at the vision that you might have set at the beginning of the year? I think it's easy to know where you want to go conceptually, but then when all the fires break out around you, you get so focused on fighting all those little fires that you lose sight of it. So I think it's a great reminder to make sure that one of the things that can help is just always having your North Star that you're pointing people back to, so that even as things change around them, they have something to anchor them and keep them focused. So I love that.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm a big fan of prioritizing my time, obviously, but different frameworks in terms of how I think about like my day, week, month, and where I actually schedule and am intentional about taking my head out of the weeds to think about that North Star. And are we still on track? Is it still the right North Star? So you're absolutely right, Todd. It's super important.
So Matt, here's going to be my last question for you. I'm 5'8", even though I try to look taller in this podcast, so people think I'm 6'2".
The camera.
Is that why you sit so close to the camera?
That's why
it all makes sense now. Finally,
that makes sense now. I got to make up for some. I'm almost 49, and I have this dream of dunking a basketball. And I've been working at it for like 3 years, and I can touch the rim, but I'm just that last little bit. I'm just not there to dunk it. So the question, Matt, here on KPIs is I am so emotionally invested, physically invested in dunking. It's like, do I give up now when I'm so close? With KPIs, I've seen a lot of CCOs. I've seen a lot of VPs of CS. They hold on to these KPIs because it's been their baby. They've put so much into it, and their team saying, "Hey, I'm spending all this time here, but it's not leading to my results." Well, you're just not doing it the right way. Let's role play that again, and let's revisit how to do this. Matt, how do you know when it's time to cut the cord on that KPI and say, you know what, that North Star is actually a South Star, and it's going in the opposite direction of where we're going to be? How would you advise someone to look at that, and what are some principles you might give them to say, you know what, Casey, Tom Brady retired and you should too. So, what is that advice there?
Yeah, gosh, it's also a really good question. I was going to say, like, sticking with the SaaS therapy theme, I would ask you, what's your internal motivation to really want to dunk, right? Like, you ask the question behind the question, what's driving you there? But no, back to the actual business question. Yeah, I think, and this is where great leaders come in, because they have like the macroeconomic perspective, they have the industry perspective, they understand innovation in terms of what their product is going to be delivering, what their customers need. I think if you're in the weeds, it can be very easy to just be focused on a specific metric and continuing trying to dunk that basketball. I think great leaders are able to elevate their perspectives, zoom out, probably solicit outside advice and counsel and those types of things, and think about like, okay, are these still the right metrics that we're driving towards? That's not necessarily an easy thing to do, because to Todd's earlier question, you then have to think about change management. Hey, we've committed our organization to driving towards this one KPI. Are we really going to pivot and go towards this next one? Right. So you have to think about the pros and cons of doing that. But that's a very intelligent business analysis and decision that you'll need to make. So I would say, like, do not be maniacally focused on just a specific number of metrics, because that's what you set as your target at the beginning of the year. You need to be adaptable at the same time, like you have to drive the right focus. So it is going to vary, but that's one of our challenges as business leaders.
And hopefully Casey can use that as some allegory to help him decide if he needs to quit or not on the basketball thing.
I've moved on. I resigned. I've moved on, Todd. I've moved on to a different goal.
You've
I will tell you
your reality, and like this therapy session has been successful.
Yeah, I've accepted. But my other goal now is probably just as dumb. But we'll talk about that on a different day.
Yes, he's going to run across America and back like Forrest Gump. We'll see. So Matt, because this is SaaS Therapy, we always like to ask our guests one final question, and that is, when you think about any good therapy session is always going to end with homework, right? It's going to end with some call to action to do something better. And so if you could give our audience any one piece of homework, one piece of advice after listening to today's episode, what would that be?
Yeah, I would say zoom out. As difficult as that is, zoom out and fundamentally think about what are the key milestones that your customers need to get to their strategic objective, whatever that objective is. And how can you best deliver that? And it may not necessarily be through your customer success function, and maybe through other functions, and perhaps that's what you want to rally around. But I would try to focus on the small number of things that are going to have the most impact. And make sure that you are ruthlessly prioritizing those, that you're funding those appropriately, that you're measuring them, you have the right KPIs around those small number of things. Do not try to boil the ocean, create a comprehensive customer journey with all these touch points. Like, there's a time and place to have that conversation, and you need to think broadly. But I would say focus on the specific things that matter.
So good. Matt, thank you again for joining us today. And man, we love having amazing guests like you. Always give us wonderful things to think about. So thank you for taking time out for SaaS Therapy today.
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
SaaS Therapy is brought to you by Brainstorm, the SaaS platform for SaaS adoption. Learn more at brainstorminc.com.